Excellent. So welcome to the voice check for what we're going to be doing today on our channel. So what I'm looking for here is to make sure that this is all working smoothly. this to make sure it's working, and I need all of the screens. No, I haven't. All right, I'll avoid that one. Oops. Go back into studio mode. Hang on, I've got your videos in all the wrong places. If I want all three of us to be talking to each other at the same time, just adjust that. I want half of us to be invisible. There we go. So nice to be back working in rigging again, Imogen.
Yeah, no, it's good. I was on a filming thing for this Korean collaboration the other week, so that was nice.
Korean
Um,
collaboration?
yeah, it's a show called Circle, and it's a drumming company from Korea. And originally, it was meant to be, lots of people traveling over, and it ended up being each of us in our respective countries filming stuff, and then it's going to be edited together at some point.
Very good. Hang on a second. Seem to have messed that up just a little bit. Welcome, everybody, to our latest session from circusrigging.info, circus rigging and safety. A little bit about the site to begin with. Our aim is to provide free guidance and information to the public about safety in Circus, we have a member section where it's about £5 a month, which supports what we do and goes towards to pay some of the people who help us put this information together, so we can use professionals, particularly where they're unsupported by other funding or employment. So come and check out this after this and see what you think. Of course, this is a YouTube stream, and we will be having a look at the comments as they come in. So if you have questions along the way, then please put them in the chat, and we'll come out and have a look at those on the way through. But first of all, let's introduction to all of our presenters for today. So first of all, welcome to Imogen. Imogen has been a stalwart in the world of Scottish rigging for a long period of time, but not that alone. Imogen, tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. So I've been working in rigging for aerial performance or the aerial arts for a number of years now, quite a long time. And alongside that, I've also worked as a rope access technician and have qualified up to IRATA level 3 and combine my circus rigging experience and work with also working together with activists to do safe work height practices for groups of volunteers.
Very good, thank you. And Chris?
Yeah, Chris Higgs. I work for a company called Total Solutions in the UK. Started getting involved with anything to do vaguely with ropes and rigging in 1973, and I'm looking forward to not having to do that anymore. In the last 25 years, I've spent training riggers all over the world, also work at height, and lots of allied stuff, and certainly inspection has always been something that people wanted to know more about. So we've included that and certainly delivered, I don't know, probably 500 or 600 courses to do specifically with inspecting the equipment we use, be it the lifting equipment or be it on the PPE side.
Right, that's better. So I just had to reset my headphones because I completely lost connection with both of our presenters. So I'm assuming that that you can hear me now.
Yep.
Oh, yes, and I can hear you too, which is even better. That will definitely allow us to actually have a conversation, which is always a good thing. So the start of this particular presentation was really to have a look at this, if I switch to the right tab in my web browser, which to do with an article which we pulled together to write called Inspection in Circus Rigging. And this is where I'd really like to start off from the beginning, because there's a variety of different laws in Europe and in the UK, which I think it would be a good place for us to actually begin with to have that discussion. So from what I can understand, and from us pulling all of these different elements together, I think that hang on, let's just get that to switch to the right place. There we go. That there's really one basic law when it comes to the provision of equipment in its own right, unless it's involved with lifting. Can I ask what either of your opinions is on that in the first place? If I go to Chris first, just because a lot of the source material from that actually came from you.
Yeah, I think that's probably not a bad way of looking at it. To make it broader, it comes from the, well, currently the amending use of work equipment directive, as opposed to what we would implement as pure in the UK. But anything that's used at work has to meet certain standards. The employees have to be trained to use it. I guess, as ever in our industry, the employment chain of responsibility, whatever you want to call it, is probably what causes the problems. And people really have a desire to know what it is that they should be doing or shouldn't be doing, don't need to be doing, without necessarily being or looking at themselves even as employers in the sort of traditional accepted sense of the word. So lifting equipment for us is separate, whereas most in terms of European countries anyway. Most other European countries don't separate it out in quite the same way as we do. Not exclusively, it's just work equipment which is subject to a greater risk. But in simple terms, any regulation of that type is going to be risk-based these days, and if there is a risk in using the equipment, then you have to make sure it stays safe to use. I guess that's the easiest way of putting it.
Excellent, thank you. Imogen, over to you on the same topic to look at the difference in the different legislations and what we would apply in Circus. What are your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of from within the UK, my understanding of it is that the overarching piece of legislation we're looking at, sort of the umbrella legislation, if you like, is the Health and Safety at Work Act from 1974, which covers all sorts of different work activities, from the provision of toilets and, hand washing facilities through to what we're thinking about here, which is, your work at height equipment or circus equipment. There's quite a few different regulations that sort of come in under that umbrella that we might think about as relevant to us. So we've got the provision and use of work equipment regulations, often sort of shortened to PURE. We've got lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations, again shortened often to LOLA. The personal protective equipment at work regulations, so PPE regs, and also as well we might be thinking about the working at height regulations, all of which sort of come with their slightly different twist on what we should be doing and thinking about when it comes to inspection. I think if you're a person who's responsible for deciding how much or when your equipment is being inspected, it's worth sort of getting a sense of what those regulations imply for you. And certainly in practice, often, there's a lot of things about, under one set of regulations, maybe you only need to inspect once a year versus 6 months. Whereas in fact, for certainly most aerial companies and circus companies, it's often easier in practice to just go with sort of the most stringent or the most frequent requirement for inspections, which would be from LOLA in that sort of at least every 6 months category. And also as well within that, not only do they have differences in timescales for when equipment should be inspected, there's also different kinds of inspections which are sort of defined within those regulations. You might have a thorough examination, a user check or a pre-use check, and you also might have an interim inspection as well. And there's sort of a lot of complicated terminology in there that it can be quite hard to get your head around, but ultimately at the end of the day, the important thing is that you are checking things regularly and checking them thoroughly, and that you have a good argument for how you're inspecting things and how often that you could justify in a court of law if it came to that.
Excellent, thank you. So, I mean, from my perspective, because all of the equipment that we use at Aerial Edge, we are using both for lifting performers as well as for suspending equipment. We don't want two separate streams or two different ways of inspecting all of our equipment. We'd rather follow the guidelines of choosing one system. So for us, it's obviously we're attempting to use LOLA and using it in that way. Let's go back to Chris here, because I also think that you have a particular viewpoint on what systems you use under what circumstances. So when is it, under what circumstances, and when is it advantageous for us not to need to use LOLA? And what would that really look like in practice?
Okay, I mean, I guess the easiest way of separating everything out is to ask yourself Well, first of all, you've got to identify who has the responsibility. So the law places a duty. It's absolutely not, a choice. You have a duty to make sure that any equipment you provide for use, whether it's for employees or people, if you're running a business, for example, to make sure it's safe to use. Then you've got to think about, that's the sort of first filter to get through. If you're an employer, you're obliged to appoint a person who is responsible for making inspections, or under LOLA thorough examinations, they're called, slightly different. But having said that, it may not be necessary because the equipment still needs to be categorized, shall we say. So I guess in answer to the question, if you are climbing up it, it's not lifting you. Therefore, you could argue that, well, you don't need to argue, it's not lifting equipment, it's work equipment. So gymnastic equipment, for example, would be work equipment. If you provide it to other people, that's, as Imogen said, that folds you back to Section 2.2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act in the UK, different in Europe, that is different. And it places the duty on the employer to make sure that they're providing a safe place of work, safe system of work, safe equipment, blah, 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 blah. So assuming that it is lifting a load, it would be subject to LOLA, and if that load is a human, then that's even more the point. LOLA actually says you inspect it as often as is necessary and you thoroughly examine it as often as necessary. If you choose not to do that, then you're obliged to use the traditional annual or 6 monthly intervals, depending on what the equipment is. And it's for lifting people, then it would be 6 months traditionally, but there's absolutely no requirement that you do that, certainly if it's not relevant. If you're only working 1 month in the year, then it's probably meaningless really to inspect it every 6 months. But you've got to be sure what you're using it for, and I think this is where the understandable problems occur, because people buy stuff from, let's say, suppliers of PPE or rope access equipment, and the primary use for it may well be as PPE, but if you're using it to climb up, it absolutely is not PPE, and the PPE regulations do not apply because it's not protecting anybody from anything. Your cloth face covering is not PPE because it's not protecting you, it's protecting everybody else. If you wear a respirator, absolutely, then it becomes PPE. It protects you from a specified hazard or hazards, and you have to be able to hold it or wear it. If you think of what I always call window cleaners eye bolts, which is a bit unfair, but the sort of eye bolts that you see underneath hotel windows in high-rise places, that's absolutely not PPE because you don't wear it or hold it, but it's still part of the system. It's not LOLA, but it's still part of a system of PPE. So I think I can understand why people get very worked up about it. And in fact, the reality, the most important thing, and I'm sure the HSE would be the first to support this, is you're inspecting it. You're thoroughly examining it. It's getting looked at rather than it falling between the cracks, which would be the worst thing, wouldn't it? So use the most appropriate. And as Imogen said, the Umbrella Act, as they always call it, the Health and Safety at Work Act, specifies that you use the regulation which is most appropriate to your activity. So if you are lifting, then obviously for us it's LOLA in the UK. If you're not lifting, and this particularly applies to things like truss structures, it's not lifting, so it's not part of LOLA. But the reality is, if you inspect it to make sure it's safe, as opposed to thoroughly examining a hoist, that's slightly different. But the truss structure needs to be right, doesn't it? So you do probably some sort of check as you're building it, maybe some sort of completion certificate once it's built, but it's not lifting equipment, so there's no requirement thereafter. But common sense dictates, if you've got a heavy season or a huge amount of rehearsal and then very sporadic shows, it's still getting wear and tear that you need to take account of. So you do a risk assessment, whatever you want to call that, and come up with, for me, certainly I've discussed it with HSE 1,000 times, something that they would refer to as a written scheme of thorough examination under LOLA, but the same methodology applies. You draw up a schedule that reflects the use that it's going to get. And if you're using it outdoors, it's going to take account of certain things. If you're using it if it's an aluminium structure, you're using it near the sea, it's going to take account of that, or a severe urban environment, that kind of thing. And I think what most people do, because in the aerial world, even though it's not really my world, but what I'm familiar with, is an awful lot of the people that teachers are also performers. Performers can be teachers. You've got companies who are effectively theatre companies, and their interests are primarily creative. They're not necessarily going to have the need, so they want to be told what it is that they should be doing, which is completely understandable. So when you ask that question, in fact, I've literally just been involved with a discussion online today with people in the States about the same thing. And what happens is people offer advice, manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, particularly, I think, carry quite a lot of responsibility in this area. And they tell you, oh no, you've got to inspect that every 6 months. Well, under their normal sort of field of operation, yes, they probably, the customer probably does. And they're saying it for all the right reasons, but then it gets adopted as law, or these myths occur, and they take a lot of shifting. And normally, unfortunately, they'll only get shifted when something goes wrong and people actually find out what it is they should have been doing in the first place. Sad but true. Sorry, I've gone on.
No. That's good. So there's a few points which come up in relation to inspection along the way, and from either side. But let's look at the concept of the different types of inspection and the different requirements upon each. So Lola has the concept of a thorough inspection. There are other inspections which come up in the other regulations which come under different terms. In reality, we've mentioned a couple here, which are, post-installation checks and other things like that. How would you differentiate and characterise those between each and any of them? Or would it make no difference at all, because they all have to be effectively inspected to the right sort of level?
For me, if it's me again, Lola's very clear. You make inspections between thorough examinations and equipment's pre-use check before you use it. How that actually pans out in the real world, if you're doing a concert tour, it'll get a periodic inspection before it gets picked to go on the job. It might even get a thorough examination, and it'll get a pre-use check probably as it gets packed, but it'll get another one on site. But that's rather different from somebody pre-use checking a cord lease or something before they use it. They may not be able to. Maybe something that you have to do from a tower or a ladder, or you have to de-rig it, lower it in. I mean, that method of having pulleys to rig from makes a lot of sense in that respect. Or you could bring your own gear in, which you've pre-use checked, which you then attach to something which somebody else has, if you like, certified. I don't like using that word, but they've assured you is up to the job. And clearly they've got a duty to make sure that it is. You've got a duty to make sure that the stuff you've brought in is safe for you to use. And this is why Lola is very specific about thorough examinations. And you've got to remember, these things originally, these regulations were aimed at the people that run crane hire businesses, offshore installations, this kind of stuff, not the kind of thing that we're doing, although the principles are the same, clearly. But a thorough examination means that you take it apart. So you could argue a thorough examination of a swivel, for example, which I know for years has caused your sector all kinds of grief. You can't thoroughly examine it unless you take it apart. And you can't take it apart. Well, you could, I suppose, but it's something you probably don't want to get involved with. It's probably better just to assume it has a lifespan, accommodate that in your budget, shall we say, measure it when you first get it, build some criteria that you can use to test it against. And I don't mean load test it, I mean measure it, stretch and what have you. But don't expect it to last. The lifting equipment industry is the same. A sling is so cheap in comparison to the crane that it's attached to. You're not expecting it to survive beyond the first lift necessarily. We don't really work in that world, do we, in entertainment? The budget is kind of everything. Buying 10 carabiners in one batch to make it easy to manage, and they're all brand new, but in a certain knowledge, you're only ever going to see, 3 of them by the end of the season because they've been lost or nicked. It's nothing to do with wear and tear necessarily, but it's the management thing. It really is. You've got to decide what you're using it for, what regulation applies. If it's pure, then it doesn't have to be thoroughly examined. It has to be inspected, because the assumption is that you're more likely talking about things like scaffold towers in our world. Therefore, an inspection is enough, and it's a visual inspection, but Pure specifies clearly, as does the directive, that the person making those inspections has to have adequate theoretical and practical knowledge to undertake the inspection properly and to determine what type of inspection is required, whether it is there might be some sort of test of stability, in which case you'd have to build it. But is that a requirement for every scaffold tower? Probably not. But that's why your competent person needs to be able to put it in the context, or a competent person. I don't mean competent person as often bandied about from sort of almost misinterpreting Lola. A person who is competent, that might be the better way of describing that person.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm definitely going to go back onto that as a topic when it comes to training, which I think is something we'll come to a little bit later on. Imogen, when it comes to inspection of more activist, shall we say, related equipment, would that be used in a more errata-related role, or are there other aspects? What sort of rigging are you doing, and what sort of inspection do you relate to that?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's probably worth saying one thing that it maybe isn't always appreciated so much from people outside of that sort of inspection and work at height everyday world is that a lot of the things we're doing, they might not necessarily look exactly the same, but they often come into very similar categories. So I think Chris has mentioned already, the pre-use checks, they're sometimes also called a user check. And the idea of those is that the person who's using the equipment should be able to do that, whether that's the person who's climbing a rope with loads and loads of gear and a harness on in an errata setting or a sort of activist climbing setting, or whether it's the teacher in a circus school who is, preparing, getting the equipment and crash mats ready. And, it's something, it doesn't need to be very complicated or difficult. It should be something that your users are able to do themselves. So it's looking for that kind, checking the equipment for obvious dangers, technical defects, potentially incorrectly installed rigging might be something that you think about or look at. Just walking into a space and going, before I entrust my life to this bit of kit, is it suitable and safe to do that? So, instead of just walking in and trusting everything's been fine and installed perfectly, checking that those carabiners are done up, that if you've got a potential for damage to the soft lifting slings around a beam, that any padding that's in place to protect them is there, that that the kit is there, safe and suitable to be used and functions correctly. It might not necessarily fall exactly into those legislative categories, but it is in practical terms a useful thing to think of when you're looking to work in any work at height scenario. Are there things that I should be checking? And those checks, they don't need to be recorded and written down and kept in your paperwork for years, but you should be ensuring that, for example, your teachers who are going into the space know what things they should be looking for and checking before each class, I would say. And then if we're looking at the thorough examination or inspection, that's a much more specialist thing that you'd need sort of training, knowledge and experience to, as Chris said, look at things in very detail, almost like looking under the microscope for those things that might not necessarily be picked up by your immediate users, whether that's a rigger or a class teacher, but things that to the level of measuring your swivels to make sure they're still how they should be, looking in very close detail at your rope or your slings or anything else, and that under a lot of the legislation we've already talked about does need to be written down and done by what's considered the technical definition of a competent person.
hang on, microphone on. In relation to the competent person, now we can define a competent person, and I think we've done it probably several times here. Someone who has the right training and experience, and how we get there is another thing. There is the concept that under Lola that the person who's doing the inspection should be from outside your organisation, and that seems to be something which is prevalent within most people's thinking when it comes to actually doing that inspection, having someone, and there are obvious reasons why people would think that. But let's switch to Chris and say what your thoughts are in that area.
Well, we legally, which, I mean, I don't like always going back to the law, but you can't ignore it. What Lola says is, if you've got the competence in-house, then you're probably better off using the people that do the work, that do the job already. Get them to inspect it, because they'll better understand the context in which it's being used, which makes perfect sense. If you don't have the competence, then you absolutely have to bring it in from outside. However, that could also be if you like, a blend. It could be a dual approach. So you've got people from within the organisation who can perhaps understand part of it far better. I mean, for example, you'll get people who understand wire rope in particular. They might be, I really can't see the need for it in circus, but you might want to bring somebody in from a wire rope company to give you some particular advice, maybe not every time you do an inspection, or a thorough examination, but they will have knowledge that the average circus person won't have. But to be competent, the employer has to decide if that person is competent to make that decision. That's the whole point. So if you've got hemp flying, for example, or using fiber ropes, repeatedly in my time, we found people from outside the sector who are condemning gear for no good reason at all. It's simply because they don't understand how it's being used. And that's why the way Lola's written for lifting equipment, but you could argue the same for work equipment, that competence may well be found in-house, and Pure certainly makes quite a big case for doing that. The only other reason, one of the significant other reasons, which I think you touched upon just now, is it could be that you're not sufficiently independent. You don't have the authority, or the boss is a lot taller than you are, or whatever it is, or the show is sold out and you can't afford not to do it, and pressure can be brought to bear, and that's clearly not appropriate, because we all know the accidents that have happened through lack of maintenance or whatever else. So you absolutely can do it. And the bit of advice I always give to people, because I spend a lot of time saying, look, you can be perfectly competent to do an inspection or thorough examination, whichever you want to call it, on a round sling, a span set, if you want to call them that, in about half an hour. We do it all the time. That you need to know, you need to be able to perform the inspection itself. If you think then perhaps of I wouldn't say a carabiner necessarily, but probably a pulley, and certainly a swivel, again, you need the information, but you can't be competent if you don't know what that information is. It's impossible. The actual doing of it, provided you've got 20/20 vision, as it were, and you're in a bright light and you've got time to do it. I normally start with time, to be honest. It's like when we do truss inspection courses. This isn't going to be quick. If the boss is giving you a day to inspect 800 pieces of truss, it's not going to happen, no matter how many people there are. In fact, you could argue it's better to have one person doing it, not a whole bunch of people. But the competence will be very different, and that's the important thing. So the employer has the duty to appoint, is the word that's used in Lola, a competent person. That competent person might be a different competent person for different bits of kit. It doesn't have to be the same person. So I think from a circus point of view, list the equipment without actually saying, right, let's talk about pulleys, or even double pulleys with a Beckett. That's going to be very different to talking about doing an inspection of a carabiner or a Mayon or whatever. There's different things. What do you need to know to inspect what I think a lot of aerial folk call rescue eights, without realizing why they're called rescue eights, but a figure eight descender with extra bits for extra friction. What do you need to know to inspect it? You can't just pick it up and say, yeah, that looks okay to me, it's got no cracks in it. That's clearly incompetent. And that's what a court of law will try and prove, that the accident happened because the equipment broke, because somebody competent didn't look at it in sort of brutal terms. With a simple piece of kit, you can't get much more simple than a figure eight.
Well, we're definitely moving towards the direction of looking at areas of competence, for sure. Now, we've got large circus companies, we've got medium-sized circus companies, but we've got an awful lot of solo person companies. Now, if we are literally lifting people as part of that, and we need to do that inspection, let's say, for example, I'm the only person who could do that inspection within the company, and I'm competent to do so, but I'm also the person who rigged it, and it's also my equipment because I own it. What position does that put me in with regards to Lola?
You'd be an expert, I would say. Understanding entirely the concept, assuming you bought the right kit in the first place. I wouldn't have it. So long as you can justify to somebody, or a good way of demonstrating or testing competence is, could you show somebody else how to do it?
That makes me competent, but does that give me the necessary separation from having my own personal investment in that particular piece of equipment?
Can you bend your own arm? I mean, I guess you could, but you take responsibility. If it's only you at risk, then, it's like they say to we motorcyclists, if you're on a bike by yourself and you fail to negotiate a bend, then, yes, you were speeding, it's illegal, but you've only hurt yourself, bad luck. Very different if you've got passengers. You're driving a coach.
A very good point. Okay, let's move into the area of training. So let's get at Imogen for this next particular area. What sort of training do you think is relevant in circus rigging from your experience to actually make you that competent person?
Well, so it's a question that probably has many different answers, like many of these things. And I'm loath to bring back that old phrase, the competent person, but I think it is ongoing, in its relevance to what we're doing. It says that to be competent, you need training, knowledge, and experience. What it doesn't say is that you need any kind of certification. That's not a requirement to be a competent person. In fact, someone can have all kinds of certifications in equipment inspection and whatever else, but if they've got no idea, how a trapeze is rigged or how this circus equipment is being used or why, then they won't be a competent person because they don't have that knowledge and experience specific to its use. I'd certainly, I've gone and done what they call the PPE competent person course as a 4-day course with examination in inspecting equipment. It is very focused on that kind of rope access equipment. In my view, it was, for me, it was a very useful course. It taught me a lot of good principles of, inspecting equipment and systems of work, and certainly the legal stuff and making sure I was doing the paperwork correctly. But I don't think that every single person who's inspecting a bit of equipment needs to go on that course or do that certification. If it's a subject you're interested in, then by all means, you have a great 4 days. You get to pull some bits of equipment apart in a pull tester, test kit to destruction. It's very interesting looking into that side of things. But ultimately, if you're saying, if you've got a competent person who knows how to inspect that equipment and they can explain it to someone else, the things that you're looking for, as long as you've got a competent person who can train another person to look at it and they're able to look at it to the amount of detail that is required for those inspections, then I don't think certification is necessarily required, although you might find it a useful thing to do.
Yeah, it's absolutely not a requirement at all, and it's down to the employer to determine what the competent person needs to be able to do. And there used to be, I think it was probably back when the LEA was still the Chain Testers Association, there was a great phrase they used to use about the fact that you might have to use other competent people, what we call vetting your contractors these days, you might need to employ a competent person to advise you what the necessary competencies might be, because ultimately the employer is still responsible. And whether they decide to get people from outside, are they the right people? Well, you have to do the same thing to the people inside the organization as well. So if you're not, as a solo person, I mean, I have no idea what the proportion of aerial circus world are sort of, if you like, one person businesses, let's call it that, because you're an employer and you're employing yourself irrespective of tax and all the rest of it. But you do have duties. Whether you would be better advised to use somebody from outside, and something actually comes to mind that we talked about in theatre particularly, is why not set up a network where you essentially identify peers in the truest sense of the word and inspect each other's kit, because then it does remove the bias, if you like, if that's a thing. I don't think it is a thing personally, but I can understand if a school was struggling financially and desperately didn't want to close or reduce the number of classes they offered, or whatever it was, reduce income as it were, then it would make a lot of sense, because you could never be criticized for trying to run the place with damaged kit. But the competent person, provided they've got the adequate competence for slings, for cloud swings, for trapezes. I mean, in a sense, the most competent person to inspect a trapeze, just a sort of basic dance trapeze, is the person who made it. Simple as that, for all the reasons that are obvious when you say it. If you haven't got that option, then what I would do, and in fact what I did, because I used to make equipment for a lot of people, is I would speak to the flyers and find out what it is they need and what they want, and learn how to do it. And then you've got it from both angles, really.
Yeah, I have found that useful from the perspective of a good equipment supplier. One of the things that they will give you is the relevant information on inspection, and obviously providing you're competent with the components of that, whether that's the ability to inspect ironwork or the ability to inspect rope and lashings and things like that, then you have the capability of applying that advice.
I remember way back in the dim and distant past, it must be 20 years ago, I did a very long course with Lloyd's British. I'm not even sure if they still exist in that form, where their intention was to produce somebody at the end who could inspect any kind of lifting equipment, which is very valuable. But of course, the reality is there was probably only half a dozen things that I personally would ever come into contact with, because I'm not from that world, and I'm not trying to be that person that is, if you like, sent out with a bag of tools in a van to inspect today a crane, tomorrow a patient hoist in a hospital, the next day a passenger lift, whatever it might be. But the fact was, you could still learn an awful lot from those guys for the particular areas that they understood. And that makes a lot of sense, and you should do that, but it's expensive. And it's certainly one of the reasons that I decided to offer work at height training for our industry, which kind of led into the inspection side as well. We do PPE inspection courses on a regular basis, but only for the things that people are actually going to be using. And certainly the average theatre, you're talking about, I don't know, half a dozen items. And I always stray away from saying this is a competent person course, because I don't think it ever can be. And that's how barristers earn their money, no matter how many courses you've done, exactly as Imogen said. But at the end of it, you can leave them knowing a hell of a lot more than they did, really getting rid of all the myth and legend. Oh, it's a harness, I've got to inspect it every 6 months. Really? Who says? And why did that? Well, we know it is, we've been told it is. Well, that's wrong. There's much better ways, and you can leave them not only empowered and enabled, but potentially saving themselves a lot of money as well. And with, not wishing for a moment to curtail the activities of some of the inspection companies. They're bloody good at what they do, but maybe our industry isn't the sort of area where they shine, shall we say.
No, indeed. A couple of questions come out of that. One of those is, you mentioned the Lifting Equipment Engineers Association. Now, they have a range of courses, like a week-long foundation course and other things like that. Are they courses which would have value in understanding of lifting equipment? Because there's obviously a lot of shared equipment between them and Circus, even if it's only about a third of what we would actually use.
I think there is, certainly if you're getting into winches and things like that, absolutely, definitely. In fact, there was it on Slack? I think there was a bit of a thread that I got involved with about the necessary competencies. And I think I put something along the lines of, you know, the ropes and pulleys and so forth. Absolutely, do it yourself. You know what you're using it for, but actually, do you know how that winch works? You know, and we certainly, in terms of equipment inspection courses, which we do a lot. In fact, I did 2 last week, I think it was, for quite large companies with large inventories. But the common sense is, don't think you can learn how to look after your chain hoists, but we will do shackles, slings, hooks, rings, slings, etc. But farm those out to the people who know how to do it, because there's such a lot of capital investment in having the testing equipment. You know, I'm quite lucky at Total. We've got a lot of gear, and we've got wireless load cells and all sorts of things that we can use, and the structure to hang it from, etc., etc., etc. But not everybody can do that. And what would worry me greatly is if people thought that by buying all the kit, that just made them competent. Of course, that's not the case either. You need to have the need in the first place, and then decide if, even then, I guess there must be an analogy with a car rental business. You know, how many cars do you need to have in your rental business before you actually have your own mechanic, as it were? And I don't know what the answer is to that, or how often do you, I mean, there's one I used to use, and they're actually an MOT station. They've got that many cars and trucks and things. It's in their interest, and it's an extra revenue stream as well. Fantastic. But your circus rigger, I would say, even somebody who's quite new to it, is going to be more competent to look at the what you would call a counterweight system, than somebody from, you know, to kind of drop them in one category, somebody who normally inspects passenger lifts. You know, it's a totally different everything. And that's not to defame them, far from it. But we should have a bit more oomph about ourselves, I think. So what do I need to know to be competent? That would be the first step.
Well, I think someone's going to have to start writing that down. Imogen, you brought up earlier the 4-day PPE course, PPE inspection course. This is a question about the use of PPE but for circus. So, for example, if we're using a harness and we're using it in counterweighting, for example, it's no longer PPE, it's actually acrobatic equipment or gymnastic equipment or whatever else. Would there be any difference in the inspections that you would be taught under a PPE course, or the criteria that you would use from the PPE course to actually using it for circus?
In my view, no, because the certainly, you know, the core questions, and I still keep them with me and think about them whenever I do inspections, that we were taught to think about on that course are, when you're looking at a bit of equipment, is it normal? Can it do its job? And so, you know, whatever equipment you're inspecting, you need to know what is normal, what it should look like, perhaps what it looks like compares to other items from the same manufacturer, but also whether it can do its job, whatever that job was. And it sort of loops back round to what Chris was saying. Again, you need to know what its job is and how you're using it in order to be able to do a thorough examination of it in any instance.
So separate question altogether. Now, this came out of me rereading the Lola regs, and particularly the section 1 of the Lola regs at the end, which gives a very good definition of what's in there, and or rather what you have to record under Lola. I was relatively surprised because I think that when I started doing a lot of my inspections, I was actually taking some of the manufacturer templates and actually using those, and then in some case taking a collection of those and putting those into an Excel spreadsheet. There's a lot of information which is missed in those than that you would find is actually required by Lola. So what sort of things are we likely to miss if we haven't sat down and read section 1, for example? That isn't a test.
The obvious one, since I went through it with 6 people just yesterday, in fact, purely by fluke, sitting next to me, there's the record of reported inspection that they each did. When was the last time that it was inspected? When's the next time it's going to be inspected or thoroughly examined, to be fair? But again, you've got to decide under what regulations you're doing that. because if it's PPE regs, actually, there's no requirement to do the inspection and record it, bizarrely. Now, if you look in Pure, they'll tell you that there maybe need to record it. And if you're moving equipment between, they still use the phrase or the word undertaking, but different businesses, whether you're selling it, whether you're giving it to other people to use in another branch of your own firm, as it were, it doesn't make any difference. The information has to pass with the equipment so that the person using it has got the information, the most up-to-date information available. So that determines what's in there. But Lola, as you say, in Schedule 1 says you've got to record X, Y, and Z. And I think one of the things that certainly, if you're inspecting, I mean, let's take the obvious example of pulley. If you were using that as part of a system of PPE, which I still fail to appreciate how that would be PPE under most circumstances, but let's assume that's the case, then you'd need to know when you bought it and when it was put into service. Under Lola, it would need to be identifiable. You'd need to have its certificate of conformity that it was supplied with somewhere, which you keep for the whole lifetime of the product. You'd have to specify the date of the next thorough examination, and you'd have to indicate under which section of Regulation 9 you were going to make the reports of thorough examination. And that could be 6 months, 12 months, following an exceptional circumstance, I think is the phrase, potential for damage, or an extended period of not being used, for example. I guess COVID would be a perfect example of that, when people couldn't use kit for a fair amount of time. So you'd indicate that, or indeed whether it's being done under a written scheme of thorough examination, which is what we do at Total. The way we use the equipment, our written scheme reflects the fact that it's very rarely lifting a load of any significance, and it's an incredibly controlled environment, because the regulations are written assuming you're working on a construction site in the middle of the North Sea or something. But you can take account of all that, which is why I think it's very appropriate. And as I said at the very beginning, I think the reality is you'll probably inspect your pulley, whether it is lifting equipment, or whether it is PPE, or whether it is work equipment. The criteria that you'll go through is probably exactly the same. It's just you do have to, as you say, retain some of the detail that you won't find on the manufacturer's template, because that's not what they intended to be used for. And that's the crucial thing. What was it intended to be used for? And if you're buying a pulley from a marine supplier, for example, and using it for lifting, then that's your problem, not theirs. They make pulleys.
Yeah, Zane in the chat made the same point. Understanding the intention of use is such an important aspect in the inspection, not just familiarity with the hardware itself.
Absolutely.
One of the other elements which I found in there, which I had not always managed to make it towards the records, was any adjustments that you actually make to any of the equipment, or any repairs that you make on the equipment during its life, is also something that needs to be recorded. Which obviously doesn't tend to get put into most of the sort of manufacturers' templates either.
Can we think of an example of where that might be relevant?
I mean, I would say that, say for example, that you decided to, adjust a steel wire rope pulley on the sheaves or something like that, or maybe make some additional lashings off on your trapeze to secure it.
So first of all, are either of those things lifting a load or a person?
I mean, they could be.
They could be, yeah. In which case, yes, you would. Playing devil's advocate, really. The repairs originally would have been intended to refer to things like annealing or welding repairs or something like that on chain, particularly. If you were shortening a chain and putting a ring on the end, then you'd need to give it another test and a thorough examination afterwards, because there's also the test and thorough examination as well. There's a lot that doesn't apply clearly to what we do, or certainly not in circus world. It's probably less the case in rigging world, but the nature of the thorough examination has to be determined by the competent person. Now, if you were to say to me, oh, but we adjust our cord lease every day and we re-seize it at the top rather than, splice a new eye or whatever it is, then that might be worth it, but it's not lifting a person. If you then attach it to a winch, yes, or a pulley system, whatever it is. But if you tie the pulley system off, which I believe a lot of studios work that system now, I don't believe that's lifting equipment anymore.
Yeah.
It's the same as a sleep.
Oh, got a little bit of echo there just for a moment. Good. So, there are a few other bits and pieces in there, like the name and the address of the person signing or authenticating the report on behalf of its author. That's obviously something which is intended for much larger organisations than smaller ones, because I would say that typically, and I don't know if Imogen finds this as well, that most of the reports that I end up writing for organisations, there isn't someone else there who has that knowledge or capability to say that this is a good document or not. Just the fact that they've received it. And even then, it will be rare to actually get someone to sign that. Anyhow. I think we've covered a reasonable amount of ground. We've got a lot of area when it comes to what inspections to use and the practical criteria. Are there any other areas that you either of you would like to bring up in discussions of inspection that we've not currently covered? Imogen?
I think it's possibly going back to something that Chris had said quite early on, which is that in a lot of ways, the important thing I'd really like people to take away is that they should be, you should be inspecting your equipment. Someone should be inspecting your equipment. I know from experience that a lot of individual artists and companies haven't necessarily always been doing that. And it's quite amazing sometimes when, you've been using this stuff day in, day out, checking it over quickly, but only when you actually really thoroughly take a look at it, you really, discover that it is taking wear and tear and needs checks. So please do either inspect it or get someone to inspect it. Keep it in yourselves safe.
Very good. Chris?
Yeah, difficult one, but I think if it's a sort of a summary, as Imogen said, your sort of takeaway from this today, treat it, I think it's true to say certainly every European country, it is work equipment. It may be a particular type, whether it is PPE or lifting equipment, whatever, it's still work equipment, and it comes under the broad heading of work equipment. And for all of us, the directive would require, or the national implementation of the directive would require users to be trained to do pre-use checks. In other words, it's not just down to somebody looking at it and seeing if it kind of looks like it did last time. What are you looking for? So you've got to train people. The carabiner should engage, screw up correctly, whatever it is, or tell them how long it should be, or you've got to measure it first thing. There's also a lot of stuff in the work at height directive that we obviously implement the work at height regulations that require things like the supervisor to go and check that fall arrest provision, for example, where it's provided is there and it is working before you send anybody to height to work. And I think those type of details are the things that people forget, and because they perhaps do these days read stuff online, oh, I've done that, that's fine, that's all I need to do. A lot of the stuff that we should be doing isn't covered on online forums at all, because it's much closer to the work, if you like, than it is to the planning. And I think the planning side is fundamental. And it's obviously easier for a business perhaps to do that than it is for an individual for many reasons. So my takeaways would be, make sure you know what type of check it is you're doing, what your responsibilities are, and make sure you know what it is, rather than just, yeah, it's fine. It always looks like that. Well, how should it look? How can you prove that? Against what criteria? The same as when we're doing truss inspection, it's very expensive, because if you go by the manufacturer's instructions, let's say you've lost 10% of the original diameter of the material, that's a fail for most manufacturers. Don't use it. Well, you try and tell the person of this ever increasing heap of truss that you're inspecting, the thousands of pounds are getting clocked up, but you've got to be able to justify that to your boss. You know, I've failed this because now with a £2.50's worth of steel screw gate, which is what we use because they're cheap and therefore nobody hides the fact that they're damaged. You know, give somebody an alley beaner that's worth 25 quid, they're not going to fess up to having bust it the first time they're taking it out. You know, chip the screw gate sleeve or something like that. If it's steel, it's cheap, and we don't expect it to last more than 10 minutes, and you know, cost recovery can be taken into account. But I think all those kind of things are worth having a discussion with people who are the users, so that they genuinely understand what it is that they're looking for, as opposed to what they perceive, perhaps.
Yeah, very good. So I think that we've covered quite a range of stuff, but obviously we've been very focused on UK examples of law in this particular area. Now, there is obviously a relationship between the European standards and the UK laws, even though we've recently severed them. But obviously there's still a lot of commonality there between those. So if we were looking at, you know, guidelines on inspection, could we loosely say that the guidelines on inspection around UK law would roughly be analogous to that in EU law in different countries?
Do you mean standards or do you mean regulations?
Regulations is what I meant, not standards. I apologise.
No, that's all right, because I mean, a lot in the work at Height and the PPE regs as well, occasionally standards are called up, which is unusual for legal documents, but it can happen. I mean, we have British standards that cover inspecting equipment.
Yeah.
I mean, there are European standards as well, but I'm not sure. I mean, you can quote any standard, even a withdrawn standard can still be used to good effect, even, you know, if it's not current. So yeah, I would say use any standard that you feel is appropriate.
Excellent. If we were to come up, or if we were to describe a good, rational approach to inspections, could you see that approach would apply across, you know, most circus and most sort of within Europe, most circus organisations? Is there anything which stands out there between different countries where it's like, oh no, it's very different there. We can't actually, you know, even say that this is a good idea because they're so much more stringent.
I doubt it, but I think as we did with ICOPA, which is a rigging, sort of international rigging code of practice, you've got to really sort of draw up a load of columns for each member state in Europe or even further afield, and then compare one with another, because there was a myth for years that in Germany, what we would call a code of practice is a standard, and what we would call a standard is a norm. And you know, when you dig into it, it's absolute nonsense. Most of what they do is exactly the same as what we do.
Yeah.
But, and I'm not picking on Germany for any reason at all, other than the DGUV in Germany do very often go far beyond what the directive requires. So there are, because of the way the insurance works, gotcha. They have issues perhaps with that we wouldn't have. And it may be the same in Sweden. I mean, the guys that have been doing the work recently will probably be able to tell us. You know, it's still workplace legislation. Arbetsplatz, if I remember my Swedish correctly. In the workplace, it has to conform to X, Y, and Z, but you're allowed to push it beyond what the directive requires. So there may well be things that do apply, let's say in Sweden, that don't apply in France, let's say.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. Last question for each of you. Bearing in mind that you both have a tremendous amount of experience in inspection itself, what's your favourite thing that you have found in inspection that you could relate here as some kind of inspection example? Imogen?
Oh, there's one that always springs to mind, and it was on a theatre show I worked on quite a number of years ago. And the show hadn't been out for a very long time, and I wasn't on it the first time it went out. And they had it was basically a pulley system where at the end one of the actors gets hiked up into the air using and with a progress capture device called a protraction. It's got a little, if people know it, it's basically a pulley with a little cam with sharp teeth that catches the rope so that it'll go through in one direction and then won't then release in the other. So you can pull someone up, and then even if you let go of the rope on the pulley, it'll stay in position. And so before using this equipment, which had been bought for the show and been kept in a box for years, I inspected all the kit that they'd brought with them. And inside the protraction, I found all this weird, moldy, brown stuff. And turns out it had been, they had a scene where they threw chocolate brownies at each other. And the brownie had somehow got mushed up and into the rope and gone through and got stuck on the protraction. And then not been cleaned and stored away in a box to then grow mold and generally be quite unpleasant. So then we discovered that a lot of the kit that had been kept in a box with it was not in great condition and needed to be replaced. But it was it's quite a good example of how you should be maintaining and cleaning stuff and storing it appropriately, as well as inspecting it when needed. Luckily, we were able to get replacement items for the things that weren't so good. There's many sort of examples of more kind of circus-related kit of things getting, bits of metalwork getting worn down to beyond, acceptable limits and needing to be replaced.
Do you still keep your collection of retired equipment?
I do, yes. It's in my storage unit at the moment.
Excellent. I think that perhaps we should schedule some sort of filming for things like that, because that's rigger porn of a different variety. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Chris?
I don't think there's anything particularly sort of favourite or things that come around all the time, apart from in every area, really, whether it's PPE or lifting equipment or whatever, people coating stuff in PVC tape and stickers and anything that's been put on for an entirely appropriate reason to protect your hands or something. But you can't inspect stuff if it's covered in stuff that shouldn't be there. And I would encourage anybody not to do that, because you're making the inspector's life a lot easier for a start. But then when you get it back again after it's been given its clean bill of health, you then slather it in PVC tape or self-amalgamating tape or something, or painting over stuff as well. It's much the same if it can be avoided. And I think perhaps it's not that prevalent, but because a lot of people will buy black equipment, unfortunately, what's underneath is often shiny, and therefore it encourages them to make it not shiny again and just get out the black U spray or the emulsion or even the Sharpie and fill in the gaps, as it were, and make it look black again for whatever reason. It's a really bad idea. What often tends to happen, and I suspect it might be the reason the manufacturers say the things they do, because most manufacturers give you advice along those lines, is when you discover that you shouldn't be covering things in whatever it is, so you dutifully go back ashamedly and then peel it all off before anybody notices. What do you get the sticky off with? And I wonder whether that actually isn't one of the reasons, apart from just not being able to see defects. If there's any damage done, is it actually using thinners or whatever to get stuff off? Other than that, I would say the most prevalent thing is we work in an unbelievably clean industry compared to many, certainly if you think about lifting equipment. But the number of people who are using trusses that are way outside what the manufacturer recommends or specifies as intact, shall we say, is astonishing. And people are very happy to cut up round slings that you can see the fibres through the sheath, but you show them a dent that goes in maybe 2.5 millimeters on a truss, and but it's the cost, isn't it?
Yeah, probably less likely to take an angle grinder through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, no particular defect that seems to be that regular, but in terms of what you see that people ignore, I would say dented trusses or gouged trusses. Absolutely.
Very good. Well, thank you both for your time. Very much appreciated. And if anyone has any questions, then please feel free to send them through afterwards or direct to email to us at circusrigging.info. Lots more things happening over the next few weeks or so, but we'll schedule another one of these on a completely different subject sometime in the next 3 to 4 weeks' time. So thank you, Imogen. Thank you, Chris. Very much appreciate your time for the session today.
Thanks for asking.
You're very
Thanks,
welcome.
Mark.
No problem. Just going to drop out. All right, so everybody else from there, if you want to pose us any questions, then come through to mark@aerialedge.co.uk and be able to answer those, or you can leave some comments underneath this video, and we'll come back and answer any questions you have in that regard as well. So I'm going to leave this running here for a few minutes, and then going to sign off for the rest of the day. So thank you very, very much.